A divorce shouldn't feel like a public execution. But when you're a poor schoolteacher standing in a ballroom full of the wealthy, no one needs to build a gallows, they simply send you an invitation. That night, when Blake Sinclair paraded his young mistress into the glittering ballroom of the Drake Hotel, 300 pairs of high society eyes turned in unison toward Tessa Ward, the discarded ex-wife in a consignment store dress. They waited for tears, waited for a pitiful collapse to savor alongside their overpriced champagne, waited for that third-grade teacher to shatter exactly as her ex-husband had scripted. But no one in that room could have guessed that at the very peak of her humiliation, a man whose name made Chicago's underworld lower its voice would step out of the crowd, call her by name though she had never met him once in her life, and do something that left the entire ballroom frozen, drained the color from her ex-husband's face, and sent the fate of a woman who thought she had lost everything down a road no one could have predicted. If you love stories of resilience, reckoning, and breathtaking comebacks, hit that like button and share this video to support the channel. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next gripping story. And now, let's step into the story. The glass of water in Tessa's hand had gone warm long ago, yet she still held it tightly, as though it were a fragile shield between herself and this entire glittering world. She stood tucked beside an ice sculpture shaped like a maple tree as it slowly melted, each drop of water falling in silence into the tray of crushed ice below, and she found herself strangely like it, something placed in the middle of a party, merely to look beautiful for a little while, then disappear without anyone caring enough to notice. A server had offered her champagne 3 times, and 3 times she had shaken her head. It wasn't because she didn't want a drink, but because she had grown accustomed to the instinct of the poor, never holding anything she couldn't afford to pay for, even when it was free for the night. A single glass of champagne in a place like this cost as much as a week's worth of groceries, and that thought alone was enough to leave a bitter taste in her throat. 2 years ago, she hadn't been the woman hiding beside an ice sculpture. 2 years ago, she had still been Mrs. Sinclair, still welcomed with smiles by the people gathered beyond her. Though now, looking back, she understood those smiles had never been meant for her. They had been meant for the name she carried. The memories came without permission, as they always did in the moments when she was most vulnerable. The stark white hospital room, heavy with the sharp smell of antiseptic, where her mother had lain barely clinging to life through the final 11 months of her existence. Margaret Ward, the mother who had bent her back working 2 jobs so her daughter could finish high school, who had pawned the only wedding ring she had managed to keep from her late husband so she could pay her daughter's college tuition, had finally passed away and left her only child an inheritance of $80,000 in medical bills. Tessa had signed every one of those bills without a second of hesitation, because there were debts people carried on their shoulders, and there were debts they carried with their whole hearts. But the memory that wounded her most wasn't the stack of bills. It was that bleak Thursday afternoon when Blake walked into the hospital room carrying a bouquet of white lilies and a blue folder of documents. He placed the flowers on the windowsill, then set the folder on the small table beside her mother's bed, where the half-finished bowl of porridge Tessa had been feeding her still remained, and spoke in the gentle tone of a man discussing the weather. He said their marriage had run its course, and that signing quickly would allow everything to remain civilized. The divorce papers lay there beside the bed of her dying mother, and Tessa signed them because she no longer had the strength to fight 2 battles at once. Blake's team of lawyers crushed her quietly and efficiently. The house belonged to the company. Their shared assets vanished behind figures she couldn't understand quickly enough, and she walked away from 4 years of marriage with 2 suitcases of clothes and 3 cardboard boxes filled with papers. Those 3 boxes had been the advice of the young appointed attorney who represented her then, the only person who had shown her any kindness throughout the entire process. She had copied everything Tessa had ever handled while keeping the company's books without pay for her husband. Just to protect yourself, she had said, because someday you might need it. That day had never come. The 3 boxes followed Tessa through 2 moves between rented rooms, resting beneath her bed like a wound she had never found the courage to open and examine again. The scattered applause from the direction of the stage pulled her back into the present. The host was announcing the Education Foundation's diamond-level sponsors, and when the name Sinclair Development rang through the ballroom beneath a wave of applause, Tessa nearly laughed aloud. A sponsor of education, while that same company waited like a vulture beside the body of its prey, because anyone in the field knew that Riverside Elementary, her school, had just been placed on the district board's list for possible closure due to budget shortages and low performance. and anyone who read the newspapers knew which company had already offered to purchase that valuable piece of land and replace it with luxury apartment towers. No one in this gold-plated room cared enough to ask where the 22 children in her class would go. Children for whom a school lunch was sometimes the only decent meal they ate all day. She had come tonight for one reason alone: to accept a modest donation check from the Education Foundation on behalf of the school, an obligation Principal Hargrove had pushed onto her in that familiar, syrupy voice of his. Then, without warning, the murmur across the ballroom changed its rhythm, rising into the sharp, restless sound of whispers no one bothered to conceal. Tessa didn't need to turn around. Her stomach had already dropped into freefall before her mind could understand what was happening. Ruby slipped through the crowd and reached her so quickly that the fabric of people's clothes brushed and tangled around her. Her best friend's warm hand closed tightly around Tessa's icy wrist, and Ruby lowered her voice into an urgent whisper. "He's coming toward you. 3 o'clock. Don't turn around yet." Tessa straightened her back and drew in a slow breath through clenched teeth, the way someone breathed before sinking beneath deep water. In the bronze mirror covering the pillar nearby, she saw his reflection moving closer, carrying himself with the unhurried ease of a man who had never once in his life been told no, and beside him was a glittering sweep of white fabric wrapped tightly around his arm like a climbing vine. The glass in Tessa's hand trembled faintly. She tightened her grip until her knuckles turned pale beneath the chandelier light. Blake stopped exactly 3 steps away from her, the polite distance reserved for strangers, and that very precision made Tessa understand at once that everything about to happen had already been arranged. "Hello, Tessa," he said, his voice carrying just far enough for everyone nearby to hear every word. "I didn't think you'd come." Kendall pressed herself close against his side, one hand with pale pink nails resting lightly on the front of his tuxedo in the way someone planted a flag in newly conquered ground. And her eyes traveled slowly from Tessa's head to her feet, lingering with careful attention on the hem of her dress, where a hand-stitched repair showed from the hours Tessa had spent bent beneath the light of her desk lamp the night before. "Oh, Tessa, this dress is absolutely adorable," Kendall exclaimed in a voice as sweet as cheap syrup. "Vintage is so fashionable right now." "Oh, wait." She tilted her head, touching one finger to her lips, as though she had just discovered something amusing. "This really is second-hand, isn't it? I'm sorry. I just assumed." A ripple of giggles spread from somewhere behind them like dirty waves. Tessa kept her expression unchanged. Only the hand around her glass tightened slightly. "Old dresses can be washed and pressed, Kendall," she said evenly. "There are other things that can't be cleaned once the filth has soaked in." Kendall's smile faltered for half a second, a hairline crack passing through the perfection of her makeup. But she recovered with remarkable speed, leaning her head against Blake's shoulder and lowering her voice into the kind of false whisper that everyone within a 16-foot radius could hear perfectly. "Blake, I don't think we should tease her anymore. You told me she used to see a therapist. We ought to be understanding." The words fell into the crowd like a drop of blood into a fish tank. Necks stretched upward, champagne glasses lowered. Tessa heard the pounding rush of her own blood on both sides of her head, because those therapy sessions had been real. 6 sessions in all. During the year when she lost her mother and the child who had never lived long enough to be born within the span of 4 months. 6 sessions she had confessed to Blake in the darkness of their shared bedroom, offering him the most fragile part of her life as people did when they believed they were safe. And now that fragile thing had been dragged before 300 people for entertainment, passed from his mouth to the mouth of his mistress, like a polished toy. Blake lifted one hand in a gesture of pretend restraint. "Come on, sweetheart. Don't bring up someone else's painful memories." Then he turned to Tessa with an expression weighed down by hollow pity, something even more insulting than contempt, and spoke in a softened voice filled with manufactured concern. "But honestly, Tessa, I heard the district is about to shut down Riverside. Life has a cruel sense of humor, doesn't it? You insisted on choosing that little job teaching children for next to nothing, and now you can't even hold on to the school." He paused for exactly the right length of time, like a conductor controlling an orchestra. "Tell you what, for old time's sake, my company is looking for a receptionist. The starting salary is probably about the same as what you make as a teacher now. Send me a message if you need it. Consider it a favor." Several people smothered their laughter into quiet snorts. Tessa looked directly into his eyes and allowed cold logic to speak in place of anger. She pronounced each word clearly. Riverside was placed on the closure list because of a budget shortage, and strangely enough, The company that offered to buy the property before the announcement had even been made public was Sinclair Development. You moved quickly, Blake, or did you know in advance? And to know in advance, who would someone have to know on the school board? The air around them thickened. The smile didn't leave Blake's face, but it hardened into a mask, and then he did what he had always done best. He released a long, theatrical sigh, looked around for sympathy among the eager faces watching them, and slowly shook his head. "See?" he said, sounding both weary and forgiving. "She's about to make a scene again. She's always been like this. She takes the smallest thing and turns it into a disaster. I offer her a respectable job, and she accuses me of making secret deals. Tessa, this is why we couldn't make it work. Everywhere you look, you see a conspiracy." And Tessa understood, with the merciless clarity of someone who had spent 4 years trapped inside this game, that he had driven her into that familiar corner with no escape. If she continued to argue, she would become the bitter, unstable woman he had described. If she remained silent, she would become the defeated woman bowing her head to accept his charity. The crowd pressed closer like a school of fish catching the scent of blood spreading through water, their eyes shining as they waited for her to break one way or another. And for a moment that stretched as long as a century, Tessa stood there utterly alone among 300 people, the glass trembling in her hand. Then something strange happened. The temperature in the ballroom seemed to drop several degrees all at once. The murmuring didn't fade. It died completely, as though someone had pulled the plug on the entire room, and the crowd behind Blake suddenly parted into 2 perfectly straight lines, not with the polite movement of people making way, but with the instinctive shrinking of small animals when a vast shadow passes overhead. An unfamiliar scent cut through the suffocating air, heavy with perfume and envy. The deep, cool fragrance of cedarwood mingled with the lingering trace of tobacco smoke, clean and sharp as a blade, drawn from its sheath. Then a voice sounded behind her, so deep that she felt it vibrating inside her chest before her ears had fully registered it. Only 2 words, calm, and yet carrying the weight of stone. "Miss Ward." Tessa turned. Every thought in her mind went silent, leaving space for a single question to echo through the emptiness. She had never met this man once in her life, so why did he know her name? The man didn't belong in this room, not because he lacked money, but because he lacked the pretense that filled every corner of it. While the men around him wore tuxedos as though they were costumes in some elaborate performance, the black suit on his body, stripped of every unnecessary detail, fit his tall frame like a second skin. Broad shoulders, a sharply cut jaw, a thin scar splitting his left eyebrow, and eyes so dark a shade of green they were almost black, the color of the bottom of Lake Michigan in the heart of winter, cold, deep, and impossible to read. Tessa heard someone behind her draw in a sharp breath, and then the name drifted low through the crowd like a sheet of paper with a razor edge. Rourke. It was Cassian Rourke, and she understood why the crowd had parted that way, because even she, a teacher living on the outer edge of these people's world, had heard that name spoken on the news in the guarded tone people reserved for great storms. The man who controlled the construction unions, the freight warehouses along the harbor, and half the building permits in the city of Chicago. The man prosecutors had named for an entire decade, without ever managing to lay a hand on so much as the edge of his coat. Blake spun around. The irritation at having his performance interrupted had barely begun to form into words before it died in his throat. His jaw locked, and every trace of his relaxed arrogance fled his posture in the space of a single breath. Cassian Rourke didn't look at Blake immediately. He stood there for another second, his eyes still fixed on Tessa's face as though she were the only person in the ballroom worth seeing, and only then did he slowly turn his gaze toward Blake, in the manner of a searchlight sweeping across a dark yard. "She isn't making a scene, Sinclair," he said, his voice low and flat, exerting no effort, and yet pressing down over the entire room. "You're only boring her, and you're boring me." Blake swallowed hard, his Adam's apple rising and falling. "Mr. Rourke, I didn't realize it was you. I mean, we were only catching up on old times. Tessa and I used to be married. I know your history very well," Cassian cut in, each word falling with the clean, heavy sound of a stone placed on a table. "I also know about those Southside building permits your company is holding. Lately, I've found myself wanting to take a closer look at them." That was all. No threat. No raised voice. A casual remark delivered as though he were discussing the weather. Yet Blake's face turned the color of cold ash beneath the blazing chandeliers, because in the world of men like him, There was no declaration of war more terrifying than Cassian Rourke saying he intended to examine your paperwork more closely, and the entire ballroom witnessed that rare moment. The moment a shark realized it was swimming beside a set of jaws 100 times larger than its own. Kendall clutched Blake's sleeve, all her sweet triumph evaporating, leaving behind only a young woman trying to make herself smaller behind her lover's back. Then Cassian turned fully toward Tessa, and the world around her narrowed until only the lines of his face remained. She felt his hand before she understood what was happening. A warm hand roughened by calluses, nothing like the hands of any crime lord she had ever imagined, sliding gently to the nape of her neck. His fingers cradled the back of her neck with the steadiness of an anchor, and his voice lowered until only she could hear it. "Stand still." The kiss came like a wave without warning. It wasn't grasping or brutal, but slow and deliberate, his mouth settling over hers with the absolute authority of a man who had never been refused, carrying the faint burn of whiskey and a warmth that made her knees threaten to give way. And Tessa, in the middle of the earthquake erupting inside her chest, heard the entire ballroom hold its breath as one. She heard a wineglass slip from someone's hand and shatter across the marble floor, crystal fragments scattering in every direction, yet no one bent to pick them up. No one dared to move. His thumb traced the line of her jaw, an anchor keeping her upright in an ocean of staring eyes, and when he lifted his mouth from hers, he didn't step back. His forehead remained close to hers, his breath warm against her cheek. "Let them watch," he whispered, those words meant for her alone. Tessa slowly turned her head. Blake stood there as though he had taken the full force of an invisible blow, his mouth hanging open, ugly patches of red spreading across his face, every layer of arrogance stripped away, until only the stunned disbelief of a man who had just realized how small he truly was remained. Kendall stared down at the floor, her shoulders trembling. "Let's go," Cassian said, his hand lowered to Tessa's waist, guiding her through the crowd as it parted automatically before them, across the polished stone lobby of the hotel, and out into the bitter autumn night, where a long black sedan waited at the curb like a patient block of steel. A thick-necked, broad-shouldered man standing beside the vehicle bowed his head to Cassian and opened the door. Tessa stopped on the sidewalk, the cold air clearing her mind. "I have my own car," she said, and she heard how thin her voice had become. "You've just been through a shock. Your hands are still shaking," Cassian replied, as calmly as though he were reading from an official report. "You can't drive in this condition, and believe me, you don't want to stand here waiting for a taxi until Sinclair finds enough courage to come outside looking for you. Get in the car, miss. Ward." The blunt, flawless logic dismantled her resistance, one piece at a time, and Tessa gathered her skirt and stepped into the leather-scented interior. The door closed behind her with a heavy, sealed thud, cutting off every sound from the city. The car moved away as smoothly as though it were gliding over water. She sat upright, both hands tightly clasped in her lap, waiting for an explanation, a price, some hidden card to be turned over at last. And finally, as the streaks of streetlight swept across the interior, he spoke. "My niece is in your class." His voice had changed, losing some of its stony weight and gaining something that sounded almost like an awkward tenderness. "Her name is Maeve. She talks about you every night." Miss Ward said this. Miss Ward did that. And Tessa, the woman who less than 10 minutes earlier had been publicly executed before 300 pairs of eyes, forgot the kiss, forgot the shock, and turned toward him so quickly that her eyes lit with the kind of concern found only in those who had made a life of planting knowledge in young minds. "Maeve," she blurted. "Maeve is your niece. Has she been getting enough sleep lately? She fell asleep at her desk 3 times during reading period this week. I was going to contact her guardian, but no one signed the notices I sent home." In the shifting darkness of the car, broken by passing streetlights, Cassian Rourke watched her in silence for a very long time, and something in those deep lake-colored eyes quietly began to change. The car didn't take her back to the rundown boarding house on the south side. Instead, it turned into the financial district and stopped before a tower of glass and steel that rose like a blade driven into the heart of the city, and Tessa tilted her head back to look at the cold glow of the words Rourke Holdings against the granite facade, wondering what she was walking into. The marble lobby was empty at this hour, but the 2 security guards straightened like measuring rods when Cassian passed. The private elevator opened without a card being scanned, and they rose in silence to the 42nd floor beneath the soft hum of height. When the steel doors slid apart, Tessa stepped into a space unlike any office she had ever seen. Polished concrete floors with a muted sheen, walls of glass stretching from floor to ceiling, and revealing the enormous golden grid of Chicago's lights all the way to the horizon. No desks, no partitions, only a long slab of solid wood serving as a conference table in the center of the room, and dark leather chairs around it, a fortress disguised as an office. Cassian removed his suit jacket and draped it over the back of a chair, and that simple movement suddenly made him seem less like a specter of power and more like a man preparing for a long shift. He poured water into 2 glasses and pushed one toward her. "No alcohol," he said. "You've had enough of what you needed to drink tonight." Tessa didn't sit. She stood an arm's length from the wooden slab, holding the glass in both hands the same way she had held the glass beside the ice sculpture, and asked the question that had been clawing through her mind for the entire drive. "Why the kiss? You could have stood beside me. You could have said a few words and that would have been enough to silence him. Why did you have to do that in front of 300 people? Cassian leaned back against the edge of the table, folded his arms, and answered in the tone of a man explaining a problem he had solved long ago. A handshake would have confused him. An argument would have angered him. But a kiss frightened him. Do you understand the difference? A handshake is courtesy. An argument is emotion. A kiss is a declaration. It told him and everyone else in that room tonight that you're no longer the woman standing alone beside an ice sculpture. Now the entire city knows you stand beside me. And in the world of men like Sinclair, perception is currency. He can trample a poor teacher with no one behind her. But he won't dare breathe too hard in the direction of the woman Cassian Rourke has touched in public. Tessa watched him for a long moment, letting his words settle, then asked in a voice that was calm and straight as a ruled line, "What do I have to pay for that shield? Men like you don't do anything for free." Something almost like amusement passed through the depths of his eyes. "You speak more like a lawyer than a teacher," he said. Then he walked around the table and placed 2 things on the wood, a photograph and a stack of blank papers. The photograph showed a little girl with dark hair braided into 2 plaits, round cheeks, and large green eyes so much like her uncle's that the resemblance was startling. "I have 2 proposals," he said. "The first is Maeve. She came to live with me after her father died. She's well behaved, but she's shy. At home, she spent almost the entire past year answering me with little more than nods and shakes of her head. Yet every evening when she sits down at the dinner table, she talks endlessly about one person. Miss Ward taught me how to fold a paper crane. Miss Ward stayed after school to help me read and didn't charge anything. I need you to become her private tutor, a few afternoons each week, at my home. I want to hear her voice more often." Something in Tessa's chest softened, because she remembered Maeve clearly. The little girl who sat at the back of the classroom with her eyes always lowered to the page. The child it had taken Tessa 3 patient weeks to coax into giving her a first smile. But she kept her voice steady. "And the second proposal?" Cassian tapped one finger against the stack of blank papers. "The second proposal is the reason for the kiss," he said, and his eyes darkened. "I know you kept the books for your former husband's company without pay for 3 years, back when Sinclair Development couldn't even afford a competent chief accountant. You saw his cash flow from the inside. You know where he keeps documents, which banks he works with, which lawyer he trusts. None of that appears in public records, but it exists in your head, and I need that mind, because he's using money and connections to block my projects on the South Side. I want to clear the board legally, one move at a time, without spilling a single drop of blood, using nothing but paper." The room was so quiet that Tessa could hear the heating system breathing softly beneath the floor. She set the glass down on the wooden slab, and when she spoke, her voice didn't tremble. "I have conditions," she said. "First, Riverside has to be saved. I don't care how you do it within the law, but the 22 children in my class won't lose their classroom. That isn't negotiable. Second, my tutoring fee will equal exactly the $80,000 in medical debt my mother left behind, paid monthly, not 1 cent more. I don't need to be rich. I need to be free of debt and able to sleep at night. And third," she stepped closer and lifted her face to look directly into those frozen lake-colored eyes. "Every piece of information I provide, every task I perform, I need to know how it will be used. I don't hand someone a knife so they can stab in the dark. So hear this clearly, Mr. Rourke. I don't work for you. I work with you." Cassian looked at her for a very long time, long enough that anyone else would have lowered their eyes. And then one corner of his mouth lifted into something that wasn't quite a smile, but was no longer ice. "Agreed," he said. "The contract will be on your desk before 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. Read every line carefully before you sign. I don't like partners who sign blindly." Partners. She repeated the word in her mind as she stepped into the elevator, and when the steel doors closed, reflecting her image in the dull metal, Tessa studied the woman standing there, a few strands of hair fallen loose, an old dress, shadows beneath her eyes, but a straight spine. And she suddenly realized something that startled even her. For the first time in 2 years, she didn't feel like crying. She felt like a blade that had been forgotten too long inside a drawer. And tonight, someone had drawn it out, sharpened it again, and left it razor keen. The contract was waiting on her desk at exactly 8 o'clock the next morning, just as he had promised. 20 tightly written pages without a single loophole, and Tessa read every line carefully before setting her pen to the paper and signing with one firm stroke. From that week on, her life split into 2 halves. By day, she was still Miss Ward, the 3rd-grade teacher at Riverside Elementary, and 3 afternoons each week. The black car came to collect her and carry her to the Rourke estate, hidden behind a row of blazing red maple trees on the north side of the city. She had imagined the home of a crime lord would be as cold as its owner. But the small classroom Cassian had created from an old study was filled with afternoon sunlight. There was a low wooden table made for a child's height, a bookcase painted cream, and Maeve waiting with her dark hair tied into 2 charmingly uneven braids because her uncle still hadn't learned how to divide her hair into equal sections. During the first lesson, the little girl remained quiet and reserved, but by the 3rd afternoon, the room was overflowing with her bright chatter like a nest filled with sparrows. "Miss Ward, is this letter pretty enough? Miss Ward, I folded the crane you taught me last time for my teddy bear. Miss Ward, can we read the story about the fox and the vineyard again today?" And Tessa sat in the middle of those eager calls, patient and gentle, occasionally laughing aloud, never realizing that beyond the half-closed door, the most powerful man on the Chicago waterfront stood silently in the hallway, afraid to step inside, because the sound of his shoes might shatter that clear, beautiful voice. For the past year, he had hired the finest doctors and filled an entire room with toys, yet he had never heard his niece speak 5 sentences in a row. This woman had needed only 3 afternoons and a stack of paper for folding cranes. The hand that had signed contracts capable of making an entire city tremble now tightened beside his body, not with anger, but with something so unfamiliar that it took him a moment to find its name. It felt very much like happiness. One Friday afternoon, the lesson ended early, and Maeve pulled her teacher by the hand into the enormous kitchen, insisting they make cookies. What followed was a scene no one in the city's underworld would have believed, even if they had witnessed it with their own eyes. Cassian Rourke stood wearing a striped apron, kneading dough under the orders of an 8-year-old child, while the most feared and solemn man in Chicago was scolded by his niece for pressing too hard because the cookies will turn tough. Uncle Cass. Tessa stood beside them, struggling so desperately not to laugh that her stomach began to ache, and because the 2 adults became distracted arguing about what temperature the oven should be set to, the first batch burned black. Smoke billowed upward until the fire alarm on the ceiling began screaming throughout the estate. 2 bodyguards rushed into the kitchen prepared for battle, only to stop dead at the sight of their employer waving smoke away with an apron. Miss Ward laughing until tears ran down her cheeks, and the little girl jumping up and down, shouting, "It's burning! It's burning," as though it were the most wonderful thing that had ever happened. The second batch was a success. Warm, fragrant cookies shaped like crooked stars, and Maeve solemnly divided them among 3 plates, declaring that the largest serving belonged to Miss Ward because she was the best teacher. The following afternoon, during drawing time, the little girl worked for a long while with her box of colored pencils before proudly holding up her picture. 3 figures stood before a house with a curling chimney. The tallest figure wore black. The brown-haired woman stood in the middle, and the little girl with braids stood beside them, holding both their hands. "This is Uncle Cass, this is Miss Ward, and this is me," Maeve announced clearly. Then, she lifted her wide, innocent green eyes toward the 2 adults, who had both fallen silent at the same moment, and asked a question so guileless that the air in the room seemed to freeze like a film suddenly stopped on one frame. "Uncle Cass, why do you always stand outside the door and stare at Miss Ward for such a long time whenever she's teaching me?" Tessa felt heat rush into both cheeks. while Cassian Rourke, a man who had faced rooms filled with wolves without blinking, suddenly discovered something deeply fascinating about the cuff of his shirt. He cleared his throat twice and changed the subject, saying it was time for the two of them to come to dinner. But the city never allowed anyone to remain warm for too long, and Tessa understood that well. So each night, when she returned to her cramped rented apartment on the south side, she sat at the folding table beside the window, opened her notebook, and wrote down everything her memory returned from the 3 years she had spent keeping her former husband's books without pay. The names of banks, the signatures, the trips to Delaware whose purpose she hadn't understood at the time, until one Wednesday night, when her memories led her to the name of a company that sounded familiar, though she couldn't remember where she had seen it. She put down her pen, knelt on the floor, and pulled 3 dusty cardboard boxes from beneath the bed. The sealing tape had yellowed and grown brittle during the past 2 years. She had never found the courage to open them again, because every sheet of paper inside carried a fragment of the life she wanted to forget. She drew a deep breath, peeled away the tape, and began turning through each bundle beneath the weak yellow light of her desk lamp. Old invoices, meeting minutes she had once been asked to type, faded photocopies she had made on the advice of the court-appointed attorney from years before, page after page, until her fingers suddenly stopped on an old bank statement, and her heart missed a beat. Tessa sat motionless beside the folding table for a very long time, long enough that the streetlight outside her window had gone dark without her noticing. The thin sheet of paper trembled faintly in her hand, though there was no wind, and only one thought remained in her mind, echoing again and again, growing clearer each time it returned. If this was what she believed it was, then Blake Sinclair had dug his own grave with his own hands 3 years ago. She couldn't wait until morning. What lay inside those 3 boxes felt like glowing coals in her hands, and Tessa knew she wouldn't be able to sleep until she had placed it exactly where it belonged. So at 11 o'clock that night, she pulled on her old overcoat, tucked the file against her chest, called a taxi after hesitating for a full minute over the fare, and crossed the city beneath the first thin veil of rain to the base of the familiar glass tower. The security guard in the lobby recognized her, gave a brief nod, and opened the private elevator. "Miss Ward, Mr. Rourke is still upstairs. He hasn't gone home yet." The 42nd floor was submerged in the suspended glow of low lamps that night. Beyond the enormous windows, rain had begun drawing slanted lines across the vast golden grid of the city, and the office was silent except for the faint sound of Cassian's deep voice coming from a small room farther inside. He was on the phone, speaking in broken phrases about shipping schedules and warehouses. Tessa intended to wait, but then her eyes fell on the massive slab of wood in the center of the room, where planning maps of the south side lay spread across one another, beside neatly stacked gray folders. She walked closer only to place her own documents there. Nothing more, and she would have done exactly that if the light hadn't fallen across a printed label on the spine of one thick folder set slightly apart from the others. 2 words that froze her entire body in the middle of a step. Ward. Tessa. Her name. Lying there among the maps and records of an empire, printed with the neat indifference of a parcel of land awaiting demolition. Her hand reached for it before reason could stop her. The cover opened, and Tessa's world tilted degree by degree with every page she turned. The first photograph showed her standing in line outside a discount clothing store at the corner of Halstead, a basket of clothes held against her body. It had been the Saturday afternoon 3 weeks before the gala. She remembered clearly because the wind had turned cold that day. The second photograph showed her leaving the gates of Riverside, surrounded by her students. The third showed her sitting alone at a bus stop on Ashland, her shoulders drawn inward, wearing the posture of someone who had no idea she was being watched. Then came the typed pages, her daily schedule recorded down to each precise block of time. She left her rented room at 6:15. School ended at 5:30 in the afternoon. The bus routes she took, even the grocery store where she bought instant noodles at the end of the month. And beneath them all, the thickest section, was a complete copy of her divorce file. Every record, every signature she had written beside her mother's hospital bed. The cold didn't strike her all at once. It seeped into her slowly, like rainwater passing through layers of clothing, one layer after another, until it reached her bones. Those photographs had been taken before the night of the gala, which meant that man had known about her, watched her, studied her before she had even known he existed. It meant he hadn't attended the party by chance. He hadn't happened to be standing nearby. He hadn't accidentally overheard her humiliation. He had gone there because of her, because the chess piece named Tessa Ward had already been marked on his board. And that kiss, the kiss that had sometimes kept her awake during the past 2 weeks. The moment she had believed was a hand reaching for her across a frozen sea had only been a move calculated to the smallest detail, weighed against a handshake, and an angry confrontation before being chosen. He had explained its entire mechanism to her in this very room, and she hadn't realized she was listening to the director describe the construction of his own play. She had escaped the hands of one manipulator only to walk directly into the game of another, one more subtle, more patient, and 100 times more frightening than Blake. Footsteps sounded behind her. Tessa didn't turn immediately. She heard him stop in the middle of a step. She heard the silence grow heavy as lead when he realized which file lay open beneath her hands. Then his voice came, and for the first time since she had known him, she heard a fracture in that voice of stone. "Tessa, let me explain." "Don't." One word, and even she was startled by the sound of her own voice. It didn't break. It didn't tremble. It held no tears. It had simply gone cold as ash after a fire. She closed the folder bearing her name, carefully and squarely, then drew from inside her coat the file she had carried across half the city through the rain, the thing she had been eager to give him only an hour earlier, as though presenting him with a victory, and placed it on the wooden surface, perfectly aligned beside the other folder. The 2 files rested next to each other like 2 sides of the same truth. "Here is what you need," she said, looking down at the table instead of at him. "Everything I could remember, along with something you weren't expecting. It should be enough for you to clear your board." She fastened the buttons of her overcoat with fingers so calm they seemed merciless. "Consider the kiss repaid. We don't owe each other anything now, Mr. Rourke." She walked past him without touching him, without looking at him, stepped into the waiting elevator, and throughout the descent of 42 floors, she stood with her spine straight, watching her reflection blur across the steel doors. She crossed the lobby, past the startled guard as he rose from his chair, pushed through the glass doors, and walked directly into the rain, which was falling harder by the second. She had no umbrella and called no taxi. She let the icy water pour over her hair and shoulders, because at least the rain was the only thing that night that didn't pretend to be something it wasn't. And on the 42nd floor, inside the vast office overlooking an entire city drowning beneath the storm, Cassian Rourke stood motionless beside the wooden slab, facing the 2 files lying close together, one containing everything he had wanted, the other containing the price he had just paid. The man who could move an entire harbor with a single phone call, the man who had never made one move without calculating the next 3, remained there for a very long time beneath the suspended light, and for the first time in his life, he didn't know what to do. The knock came close to midnight, 3 slow, heavy blows, and Tessa, who had just changed into dry clothes while water still dripped from her hair, stood motionless behind the thin wooden door, looked through the peephole, and couldn't believe what she saw. Cassian Rourke stood in the hallway of her boarding house beneath the flickering yellow light of a fluorescent tube, surrounded by peeling walls, stained in uneven patches, and the sound of a neighbor's television leaking through the partitions. His black coat was soaked through and clung to his shoulders, his rain-drenched hair sending drops of water down into his collar. There was no car blocking the entrance, no bodyguard standing watch by the stairs, only a solitary man dripping wet, looking so out of place in the cramped, worn world he had never once been forced to enter, that the sight of him seemed almost absurd, and Tessa understood the meaning of that image before she could even summon her anger. For the first time, he hadn't pulled her into his world. He had stepped into hers. She opened the door but remained in the threshold, blocking his way. "If you came to renegotiate, go home. I already told you, we don't owe each other anything." "I didn't come to negotiate," he said, his voice roughened by the cold. "I came to repay the last debt. The truth. All of it. After that, if you want to close this door forever, I won't come back." Perhaps it was the rain. Perhaps it was those 2 words, the truth. Or perhaps it was because never in her life had she seen a man with so much power standing in the hallway of her home, asking for permission to speak. But Tessa stepped back and opened the door wider. Her apartment consisted of a single room, with a narrow bed pushed against the wall, a folding table beside the window still cluttered with papers, and 3 open cardboard boxes resting on the floor. She made tea in an old electric kettle with chipped enamel, placed 2 mismatched cups on a worn coffee table whose uneven leg had been propped up with a book cover, and Cassian sat on a low plastic chair, the same man who was accustomed to leather seats on the 42nd floor, without offering a single comment. He wrapped both hands around the hot cup as though it were something precious. Then he began to speak, his eyes fixed on the thin steam rising from the tea instead of on her. "I had a younger brother named Declan. He was 6 years younger than I am," he began, his voice low and even, like a man reciting a page he had memorized after reading it too many times in the dark. "He was the kindest person in our family. He stayed away from my business, earned his own degree, found work as a construction foreman on his own. He used to tell me, 'You build your empire your way, and I'll build houses mine.' Every Christmas, he still brought his wife and daughter to see me. Maeve talked 10 times more then than she does now." He paused and took a sip of tea, and Tessa watched the knuckles around the cup slowly turn white. 2 years ago, the scaffolding collapsed at the site where he was working. My brother never came home. Only one sentence, brief and hollow as an open grave. That site belonged to a Sinclair development project. The inspectors came in, and the final report concluded that the foreman had been drinking during working hours. Tessa, my brother never touched a drop of beer in his life. He had been allergic to alcohol since childhood. Everyone in our family knew it. The men who worked with him knew it. But the report had signatures. It had official seals. It even had an inspector who suddenly managed to buy a new house 3 months later. So Sinclair's company walked away clean, without paying a single cent in compensation, while my brother's name appeared in the newspapers beside words like drunk and irresponsible. His wife couldn't bear it, he continued. This city looked at her with a mixture of pity and contempt. She carried that humiliation away with her, and left Maeve with me. From that day on, the child almost stopped speaking. And he lifted his eyes, and for the first time, Tessa saw that the winter lake in them wasn't cold. It was wounded. I began hunting Blake Sinclair, not in the way people tell stories about the Rourke family. Had I wanted that kind of ending, he wouldn't have been standing at the gala that night. No. I wanted him to collapse in exactly the same way he destroyed my brother's name. Through documents, through official seals, through the law, publicly, in a way he couldn't dispute. So for 2 years, I built files on everything connected to him, his partners, his lawyers, his creditors, every person who had ever passed through his life, including. He paused for a moment, the wife he abandoned. "You were a name in a file, Tessa," he said, neither avoiding the truth nor trying to soften it. "At first, that was all you were, a possible link who might know something. My people photographed you and recorded your schedule, exactly as you saw. I won't apologize for investigating. That is how I have survived for 34 years. But then one evening, Maeve sat down at the dinner table and, for the first time and longer than I could remember, spoke to me in a complete sentence. Uncle, my teacher stayed after school to help me read, and she didn't ask for any money. Then she kept talking, night after night. Miss Ward said this. Miss Ward did that. Until one day, I picked up your file and read it again, and realized those 2 names belonged to the same person. The woman in the photograph sitting with her shoulders drawn inward at a bus stop, and the teacher who had brought my niece back to life were the same woman. I went to the gala because of the file. I admit that. But the moment I walked through that crowd, Tessa, I swear on my brother's grave, I didn't walk toward you because of the game. The room remained silent for a long time, with nothing but the steady tapping of rain against the windowsill. Then Tessa heard her own voice begin to speak, telling him what she had never fully told anyone. She spoke of the 11 months spent beside her mother in the hospital, of the divorce papers placed beside the bowl of porridge, and of the deepest wound of all, that during the most exhausted months of her life, she had lost a child who had never lived long enough to be born. She told him that when Blake heard the news, he had said only one thing, probably for the best, one less complication. She told him that the 6 therapy sessions he had turned into a joke at the gala were the 6 sessions in which she had learned how to breathe again after enduring 2 funerals in succession. Cassian offered no words of comfort. He didn't reach across the table. He simply sat there and listened with his whole being. And when she finished, 2 people carrying 2 separate griefs looked at each other through the steam rising from tea that had already gone cold. Each saw in the other what no one else in the city had ever seen. Not a crime lord. Not a poor teacher. Only 2 human beings who had lost what they treasured most, and had still been forced to remain standing. At last, Cassian rose, adjusted his still damp coat, and extended his hand across the worn coffee table. "Let's begin again," he said. "This time, No files and no hidden moves. Every card face up on the table. You know why I'm fighting, and I know why you're fighting. Tessa looked at that calloused hand for 1 second, then placed her own in it and held firmly. It was the second handshake between them, and this time, there wasn't a single secret left standing in between. The following afternoon, the black car didn't take her to the estate or the glass tower. Instead, it drove along the water toward the iron cranes silhouetted against the gray sky, and when Tessa stepped out, the wind off Lake Michigan struck her face with the taste of salt, mingled with diesel fumes and rusted steel, a rough, honest smell that felt strangely welcome after so many nights steeped in perfume and lies. Cassian stood waiting at the end of the pier, wearing a heavy wool overcoat with the collar turned up against the wind. He looked entirely different here than he did on the 42nd floor, not like a master looking down at the city through glass, but like a part of this land itself, hard, quiet, and without ornament. He nodded as she approached. You can't understand a war by looking at maps alone, Tessa. You have to come out here and smell the ground. He raised one hand and pointed across the channel, where a vast strip of land lay silent behind barbed wire fences, with rows of gray metal-roofed warehouses and cracked concrete yards where weeds pushed through the broken surface. Farther beyond, among the low buildings of the south side, she could make out the faded rooftops of Riverside Elementary. Blake Sinclair looks at that land, Cassian said, his voice slow and precise beneath the sound of the wind. And he sees luxury apartment towers covered in glass. He sees a marina. He sees coffee shops charging $8 for a cup to serve the same people he raised champagne glasses with at the Drake Hotel. He sees a playground scrubbed clean for the wealthy. I look at it, and I see a transportation gateway. Whoever controls this stretch of waterfront controls the throat of the shipping route that feeds 1/3 of the city. My warehouses, my harbor, and the livelihoods of thousands of union workers all breathe through that throat. He doesn't need the land. He only needs to squeeze it until I suffocate. Tessa looked across the dark water as the wind blew several strands of hair across her face. And while he sees dollar signs, she said quietly, I see my 22 children. I see the ones whose school lunch is sometimes the only decent meal they have all day. I see Maeve, who has only just learned how to laugh again, and I see all of that being traded away for a few glass-covered buildings. She opened the canvas bag she had brought with her and removed a neatly clipped stack of documents. And I see this. She spread the papers across the top of a wooden crate beside the railing and placed a stone on each corner to keep the wind from carrying them away. This is what I found in the 3 boxes. What I brought to you that night, she said, resting one finger on a yellowed bank statement. 3 years ago, when I was keeping his books without pay, I made copies of certain documents on the advice of my court-appointed attorney. This loan file was among them. Look here. A group of 3 commercial buildings on Hudson Street was pledged to Capital Fidelity Bank as collateral for a large loan. It's written clearly in black and white, with the signing date plainly recorded. And here. She turned to the next page and placed the 2 sheets side by side. The exact same group of 3 buildings, with the same addresses and the same parcel numbers, appears in another mortgage agreement with Union Mutual Bank, signed only 4 months later. He used the same property as collateral with 2 different banks, placing 2 debts on top of a single foundation. And to keep the 2 banks from ever seeing each other, he routed the second loan through an intermediary company registered in Delaware, the name that haunted me for several nights, because I knew I had typed it somewhere before. Meridian Crest Consulting. Cassian bent over the documents and read them quickly, and Tessa saw his jaw tighten as the pieces locked into place. Bank fraud, he said quietly. This isn't merely dirty business anymore. This is a federal criminal offense. But you haven't heard the best part yet? Tessa replied, and she pulled out the final sheet, a photocopy of Meridian Crest's business registration that she had found buried at the bottom of the 3rd box. He never puts his own name anywhere near something dangerous, so this shell company needed a clean name, someone trustworthy enough, infatuated enough, and naive enough not to ask what she was signing. Look at the name of the registered agent. Cassian looked down, and even he went still for a moment. Kendall Price. Exactly, Tessa said as the wind made the papers tremble beneath the stones holding them in place. The beautiful young mistress he brought to the gala to humiliate me is the person legally listed as the representative of the company carrying his double debt. And there is one detail I'm certain Blake himself forgot a long time ago. Under the law, every official document connected to the company tax notices, court summonses, bank letters, is sent to the registered agent's address. That means every trace of this fraud has been flowing through Kendall Price's mailbox for 3 years without either one of them paying attention. He turned his mistress into a shield, and she has no idea she is holding a bomb. Cassian straightened and looked at her with an expression Tessa had never seen him give anyone else, the kind of look one reserved for a flawless weapon. But when he spoke, his voice remained steady and disciplined, the voice of a commander. These copies are gold, but they are raw gold. They tell us where to dig. To finish him in court, we need the originals, the server records, and a lawful path that brings everything into the light. He will fight back, Tessa. A cornered man always bites dirtiest. He will strike at the place where you hurt most. He paused, and when the question came, it carried no mockery, only absolute seriousness. Are you afraid? Tessa turned toward the gray, rippling water, where the wind carried the smell of rust and the distant cry of a ship's horn. Then she turned back and looked directly into his eyes. I lost my mother, my child, my home, and even my name, she said, each word falling solidly like a foundation stone. What else does he have left to take from me? And a person with nothing left to lose, Cassian, is the most dangerous person of all. A slow and dangerous smile spread across the face of the man standing before her, the kind of smile perhaps no one in Chicago's underworld had ever seen. Good, he said softly. Then let's go build a guillotine. But they had underestimated the nose of a cornered animal, because Blake Sinclair might have been inept at managing money, yet he possessed an instinctive sensitivity to danger whenever it crept near him, and when unfamiliar questions began circling among his business partners, when several bankers suddenly started asking about the buildings on Hudson Street, he didn't wait to see what was coming. He struck first, viciously, filthily, and with merciless precision. The blow fell on a clear Monday morning, just after Tessa had finished hanging her students' autumn drawings along the classroom wall, when she was summoned to the principal's office. There, behind the polished wooden desk, Walter Hargrove sat with the gray face of a man who had swallowed something terribly bitter. In front of him lay a document bearing the letterhead of the Department of Education. He pushed it across the desk with the tips of 2 fingers, as though he were afraid it might burn him, and he couldn't bring himself to meet her eyes. It was a notice of immediate suspension from teaching duties pending an investigation, and the reason had been typed in language so neat and lifeless it seemed almost inhuman. A member of the teaching staff had maintained a personal relationship with an individual suspected of involvement in organized criminal activity, thereby damaging the reputation of the profession and compromising the safety of the school environment. Tessa read the paper twice, slowly, and what chilled her wasn't its contents, but its speed. A decision like this would ordinarily have required a board review, official minutes, and weeks of procedure. Yet it had been signed after only 1 weekend. Someone had made very late telephone calls to very powerful people, and she knew exactly whose hand had pulled those strings. There's nothing I can do, Tessa, Hargrove stammered, his fingers twisting together on the desk. The order came directly from the department. I'm only the person delivering the paper. Then he looked up at her for the first time, his eyes filled with both pity and fear. But listen to an old man's advice. I've lived a long time, and I've seen a great deal. Men like Rourke use people, and when they're finished, they throw them away. You're sacrificing your entire career for a man who won't even remember your name once he gets what he wants. Tessa folded the suspension notice into 4 neat sections and slipped it into her coat pocket. When she answered, her voice was so calm that even Hargrove blinked. No one will ever throw me away again, sir, she said. Blake already used up that privilege for every man in this world. But the first blow had only been the beginning, because by noon, while she was still gathering her belongings, her phone exploded with messages, and Ruby burst into the classroom holding up her phone, her hand trembling not with fear but with fury. On the front page of the city's most widely circulated tabloid was a stolen photograph of Tessa stepping out of the black car in front of the Rourke Tower, placed beside a blurred image from her old identification card. Beneath them, a bold headline consumed half the page. Mentally unstable woman clings to underworld kingpin. Inside the article, through phrases attributed to unnamed sources close to the matter, they exposed her treatment records, the 6 therapy sessions from years ago, the diagnoses cut apart and printed in heavy type, the most private and painful period of her life, dragged into the marketplace and seasoned into the portrait of a deranged, opportunistic woman. Only one person in the world had ever held those records in his hands, and Tessa stood motionless in the middle of her classroom, realizing the cruel perfection of Blake's move. He didn't bother denying his crimes. He simply set fire to the witness. From that day forward, anything she said about him would be heard by the entire city through a contemptuous sneer. Oh, that mentally ill woman who attached herself to a rich crime lord. Ruby was so furious that she paced between the rows of desks. "I'll call the union. I'll call a lawyer. I'll call every parent myself," she said through clenched teeth. But Tessa only shook her head gently and asked her friend to go home. She wanted to remain alone for a little while. Late that afternoon, when the hallways had fallen silent, Tessa packed the last of her personal belongings into a cardboard box. A tiny cactus one of her students had given her. A stack of birthday cards covered in clumsy children's handwriting. The first paper crane Maeve had ever managed to fold. Then she pulled out a chair and sat in the center of the empty room, surrounded by 22 small desks, arranged neatly for the children who would arrive the next morning and discover that their teacher was gone. On the green chalkboard, the words from her final lesson still remained in her own careful handwriting, teaching the children how to join sounds together, with a hastily drawn flower in one corner, as a reward for the whole class reading aloud so well. Tessa sat there for a very long time in the deep orange light of the dying afternoon. She didn't cry. She felt only empty, as though someone had reached into her chest and removed the last thing that remained. For 2 years, her life had been stripped away one piece at a time, like a person losing layer after layer of clothing in the middle of winter. And today, they had taken the final garment, the identity she carried when she stood before a classroom. Darkness had settled outside when she heard familiar footsteps stop at the doorway. Cassian stood there, still dressed in black, holding the tabloid so tightly rolled that it had crumpled in his hand. He didn't ask whether she was all right. He didn't apologize on behalf of the world. He didn't promise that someone would pay. He simply walked between the rows of tiny desks, placed the newspaper face down on the teacher's table as though covering something filthy, then looked directly at her. He took another step forward, and when he spoke, his deep voice held no trace of soothing tenderness. "But after all this time watching you, I've understood something. You were never fragile. You're steel. Steel that life has forged again and again for 27 years, through furnace after furnace, from loss to betrayal and back again. And steel isn't forged so it can be placed on display, Tessa." He stopped in front of her, his lake dark eyes gleaming in the shadowed classroom. "Once steel has been forged, it's meant to cut." That night, on the 42nd floor, as Tessa spread the crumpled tabloid across the wooden slab and reread every filthy line with eyes that had already dried beyond tears, something strange began to happen inside her mind. The pain slowly retreated into the background, making room for the cold, clear reasoning that 3 years spent typing meeting minutes for some of the finest lawyers had taught her without anyone ever meaning to. She lifted her head and looked at Cassian with an expression that stopped him in the middle of his sentence. "Wait," she said slowly. "Look carefully at this article. They published my medical records, treatment records protected by law. They declared me mentally unstable without verifying a single fact and without asking me for a statement. They printed my photograph beside fabricated conclusions that directly damaged my reputation and cost me my job. Cassian, this isn't an attack. It's a gift." In his eagerness to crush me, Blake committed the one offense we can touch in black and white: defamation and invasion of privacy. And once I file a lawsuit, she tapped one finger against the newspaper, the court will open a door for us that no power in this world could force open. The right to demand that the defendants surrender evidence. Cassian watched her for a long moment, then that rare light appeared again in his lake dark eyes. He picked up the phone and called the office of Rourke Holdings' chief counsel before the night was over, and the machinery began to turn. The lawsuit was filed on Thursday morning, with Tessa Ward named as the plaintiff, and the tabloid and Blake Sinclair named as defendants. Blake in his capacity as the source who had unlawfully supplied her private medical records. The complaint demanded compensation for the damage to her reputation, along with a long list of materials to be produced during discovery. And it was within that list that the lawyers of Rourke Holdings, guided by Tessa, concealed hooks sharpened down to the last word. Every email connected to the transfer of the plaintiff's medical records. Every server file containing communications that mentioned the plaintiff's name during the previous 3 years. Every financial record connected to payments made to third parties during the same period. On the surface, the phrases appeared to serve only a defamation case, but their scope, when read carefully, spread as wide as a net cast through the very entrails of Sinclair Development. The miracle was that no one on the other side read them carefully, because at that precise moment, through a coincidence that wasn't accidental at all, the company's Southside construction permits were suddenly being examined by multiple departments at once. Inspectors arrived. Business partners called without pause. Blake's lawyers ran like men fighting fires across a dozen fronts, and amid that carefully directed chaos, the documents approving the scope of discovery in what they dismissed as the petty lawsuit of a bitter schoolteacher were signed in haste simply to clear them from the desk. Not one person sat down and read all 3 pages of the attachment. "He just handed you the key to his house himself, Tessa," Cassian said on the evening the first boxes of data were copied under court order, his voice carrying something close to astonishment, mixed with admiration. "He burned down your home, and the flames lit the path that leads straight into his safe. Now all we have to do is walk inside." And they walked inside. The secured conference room on the 42nd floor became a command center. Computers ran day and night. The financial investigators of Rourke Holdings, quiet people with eyes that missed neither a comma nor a decimal point, sifted through hundreds of thousands of files extracted from Sinclair's servers, while Tessa sat among them like a living map. Machines could locate the data, but only her memory knew which files carried blood through the body. She remembered the abbreviations Blake used when discussing matters he didn't want anyone else to understand. She remembered his habit of transferring money on Friday afternoons before holiday weekends, because fewer bank employees were available to review transactions. She even remembered the private nickname he used for his most trusted accountant. And one by one, the files she directed them toward opened and aligned with the yellowed photocopies from the 3 cardboard boxes, like keys sliding into locks. The Capital Fidelity loan records matched the Union Mutual loan records on the same group of Hudson Street properties. The money moving in circles through Meridian Crest Consulting revealed every stage of its journey, and the payments labeled as consulting fees flowed steadily into an account connected to a member of the school board, the very person who had argued most aggressively in favor of closing Riverside Elementary. Each night, the whiteboard in the room grew denser, with red lines connecting one square to another, and after several weeks, the entire picture emerged beneath the lights, a vast map of fraud, sophisticated in appearance, but rotten at its core, waiting only for pressure in the right place before collapsing like a building raised on a foundation that had been mortgaged twice. Across the city, inside the headquarters of Sinclair Development on a cloudy afternoon, the young communications director carried a tray of coffee past the private conference room on the top floor, just as she did every day. And through the narrow gap of the door, which hadn't fully closed, the restrained, furious voice of the chief counsel drifted into the empty hallway. "I'm telling you for the last time. That Delaware company is registered in her name, not yours. Every document carries her signature. If this explodes, your communications director will take the first blow, not you. Do you understand?" Kendall Price's hand froze on the doorknob. Coffee spilled across the edge of the tray. Nearly 3 months had passed since the night of the gala at the Drake Hotel. 3 months that, if anyone had asked, Tessa wouldn't have measured in days or dates. She would have described them through 3 images, because that long, unbroken stretch of time had compressed itself into 3 scenes, carved into her memory as deeply as markings cut into wood. The first was the enormous whiteboard covering an entire wall of the secured conference room on the 42nd floor. At the beginning, it had held only a few boxes and several arrows, but now it was as tangled as an astronomical map of human greed, boxes bearing the names of banks, companies, and people, all connected by red strings stretching in every direction. Each string represented a proven flow of money. Each knot was a signature that couldn't be denied. And on certain nights, when Tessa stepped back to take in the whole board, it resembled a vast red spiderweb that the spider had unknowingly spent 3 years weaving around itself. The second image was of cold takeout containers, lying forgotten across open planning maps at 2 o'clock in the morning, on nights when only the 2 of them remained in the command center. She would examine each page of a bank statement beneath the desk lamp, while he stood by the window, finishing his last telephone call with someone in another time zone, and then they would sit together and eat noodles swollen and soft from sitting too long, sharing a strange silence that didn't need to be filled. It was during those quiet hours at 2 o'clock in the morning that Tessa realized something that left her both confused and peaceful. She no longer felt tense beside this man. Their minds ran parallel like 2 railway tracks, Neither had to perform for the other. Neither had to make themselves smaller in order to fit the other person's expectations. During all 4 years of her marriage, she had never once been allowed to sit in silence and still feel so completely seen. And the third image, the smallest of them all, was the one she remembered most clearly. One evening, while she was bent over a mountain of documents, a cup of tea was placed beside her hand so gently that it made no sound. A thin ribbon of steam rose from it, carrying the soft fragrance of chamomile. She looked up and saw Cassian already turning away toward the whiteboard as though he had done nothing at all, leaving behind only one blunt remark. "You drink too much coffee." Tessa sat there staring at the tea for a very long time, because she suddenly realized that this man had noticed what she drank, how much she drank, and had been paying attention for longer than she knew. Not a single declaration of love was spoken during those 3 months. Not one gesture crossed the boundary between two partners. There was only the cup of chamomile tea that appeared regularly on late nights, the coat silently draped across the back of her chair whenever the room grew cold, and the silences they shared, which increasingly resembled something Tessa didn't dare name, something that felt more and more like home. In the middle of those days spent sharpening the blade, there came an afternoon when Cassian entered the conference room carrying a rolled sheet of paper tied clumsily with a red ribbon. He handed it to her with a rare look of awkwardness. "Maeve sent this. She made me promise to give it to you personally." When Tessa untied the ribbon and opened the paper, her chest tightened with a sweet ache. Inside was a carefully flattened yellow paper crane. Its wings unfolded to reveal a small drawing of Riverside Elementary with a bright yellow sun above it. In the corner, written in crooked, uneven purple marker, were the words, "Please come back and teach me soon." The child knew nothing about the storms raging through the world of adults. She didn't know her teacher had been suspended. She knew nothing about whiteboards covered in red strings or court orders. She simply missed her teacher and believed with complete certainty that she would return, the pure and absolute faith of an 8-year-old child, something no one else in the city seemed capable of preserving. That evening, when Tessa returned to her rented apartment, she took 4 pieces of tape and carefully fastened the drawing to the door of her old refrigerator. She stepped back, studied it, adjusted it until it hung straight. And as she stood in the cramped room, watching that brilliant yellow sun cast its painted warmth across the chipped refrigerator, she realized something that made her eyes sting. For the first time in the 2 years she had lived there, the room felt like a home, but this city, as she had learned, never allowed anyone to remain warm for too long. 3 days later, when Tessa returned from the 42nd floor at dusk, she stopped at the threshold. On the folding table beside the window, which had been empty when she left that morning, lay a thick, yellow-brown envelope. There was no stamp, no postal mark, and no name identifying the sender. Someone had entered her apartment, or had arranged for someone else to enter, placed it there, and disappeared without leaving a trace. Her heart pounding, she tore open the edge of the envelope with cautious fingers, and what slid out forced her to collapse into the chair. They weren't photocopies. They weren't screenshots. They were original bank transfer records printed on official paper, each bearing an embossed seal, showing every payment labeled as a consulting fee that had been transferred regularly for 2 years from Meridian Crest Consulting into an account whose owner she had memorized during the long nights spent tracing the red string board, the school board member who had fought most aggressively to close Riverside Elementary. This was the missing link, the original evidence that none of their court orders had managed to uncover because it had never been stored on a server. It had been sitting inside one person's mailbox. Tucked among the transfer records was a small piece of paper folded in half. Inside was a single handwritten sentence in slanted feminine script, 6 words as cold and precise as a blade. "I won't serve time for him." The meeting invitation was sent under the guise of a mediation session for the defamation lawsuit. The location was a neutral office downtown, and the time was 9 o'clock on Tuesday morning. Tessa had chosen that day herself, and not by accident. Tuesday was an ordinary, nameless day in the middle of the week, with no holiday and no significance. The kind of day when people paid debts and received sentences as casually as they paid an electric bill. She wanted Blake Sinclair to collapse on a day as unremarkable as that. The morning was clear and cold. Tessa entered the building wearing a charcoal gray suit borrowed from Ruby, the sleeves turned up once because Ruby was taller than she was, carrying nothing but an old, slim leather briefcase. As she passed the frosted glass along the corridor, she caught a glimpse of her reflection. The woman in the glass didn't resemble the teacher who had hidden beside the ice sculpture 3 months earlier. Her spine was straight, her steps were even, and her eyes were as calm as the surface of a lake before a storm. The glass-walled conference room overlooked the street, with a long oak table running through its center, and at the far end Blake Sinclair was already seated with 3 lawyers. But the man sitting there was no longer the one who had strolled through the lobby of the Drake Hotel with effortless confidence. 3 months of bleeding across a dozen legal fronts had visibly worn him down. Dark circles were carved beneath his eyes, his skin looked gray beneath the ceiling lights, and the tailored suit that had once fit him perfectly now seemed a full size too large across his diminished shoulders. The moment the door opened, he spoke, and the voice that had once poured out smooth and superior as honey had risen half a note, becoming sharp and thin. "This mediation is a farce. We came here to put an end to your ridiculous lawsuit, Tessa, and I'm warning you now, you won't squeeze a single cent of compensation out of me." Tessa didn't answer. She pulled out the chair at her end of the table, sat down, and placed the leather briefcase on the polished wood. At that exact moment, the door opened again. Cassian Rourke walked in alone, without lawyers or attendants, wearing a suit so dark a shade of blue it was nearly black. He moved along the length of the room through a silence so sudden that the breathing of the air conditioning could be heard. The 3 lawyers across the table sank lower in their chairs at once, as though an invisible hand had pressed down on their shoulders. Cassian pulled out the chair to Tessa's right, sat down, unfastened his jacket, and leaned back comfortably, like a man attending a performance whose script he had already read. Then he spoke in his calm, deep voice. "Please begin, Miss Ward." Tessa opened the leather briefcase and removed 3 thick, heavy files bound in black covers. She stacked them neatly in front of herself for 1 second. Then, with one decisive movement, pushed all 3 across the gleaming oak table. They glided silently and stopped precisely in front of Blake like 3 gravestones. "What is this?" Blake asked, without reaching for them. Tessa began to speak, but not in the voice of a plaintiff, and not in the voice of a betrayed woman. She used the same voice she had used every morning before her 3rd grade class. Slow, clear, and patient. The voice reserved for students who were struggling to understand, and that professional gentleness made every word colder than any shout could have been. "Blake, sit up straight and listen carefully, because I'm only going to teach this lesson once." He froze. The reflex to obey a teacher's command made his spine straighten before he realized what he was doing and forced himself to stop. A strip of red climbed up his neck. "The first file," Tessa said, pointing to the folder on top, "will be delivered to Capital Fidelity Bank tomorrow morning. Once their legal department finishes reading what is inside, they will activate the clause demanding immediate repayment of the loan. Their procedure takes 48 hours. I typed enough meeting minutes to know exactly how quickly they move when they smell risk. The second file will reach Union Mutual Bank that same morning. They are slightly slower, but their first response will be to freeze every piece of collateral, which means every brick registered in your name will be locked down before the weekend. No buying, no selling, no refinancing." She paused for 1 beat, exactly as she used to pause before announcing test scores. "And the 3rd file, should I choose, will be sent directly to the federal prosecutor's office. The charge is bank fraud. The maximum sentence is 10 years. And with what is contained in that file, Blake, there isn't a lawyer alive who could argue that you deserve probation." Her gaze moved slowly around the table, from Blake to the 3 lawyers sitting rigidly beside him, and then she asked the same question she had always asked her class. "Has anyone fallen behind?" No one answered. The lawyer seated in the middle was the first to break free of the paralysis. He leaned forward, dragged the first file toward himself, and opened the first page with the irritation of a man forced to clean up something trivial. He turned the second page more slowly. By the 5th, his fingers had begun moving at an entirely different speed. The other 2 lawyers crowded over the 2nd and 3rd files, and Tessa remained still, watching the faces of all 3 men change with every page they read, from annoyance to attention, from attention to unease, from unease to the undisguised, bloodless horror of men who had just realized their client wasn't standing at the edge of a cliff, but had been hanging beyond it for 3 years. One of them muttered something that sounded like, "My God." Blake snatched the file from his lawyer's hands and began turning the pages himself. The farther he read, the more violently the papers trembled between his fingers. Bank records printed on official paper still bearing embossed seals, stamps that couldn't be forged. His own signatures appearing page after page like ghosts standing in line to collect a debt. Then he shot to his feet. The chair scraped harshly across the floor. Both hands slammed onto the oak table, his ashen face twisting, and he roared the only question left inside his mind, a question that was already a confession. "Where did you get these originals?" His roar hung suspended in the glass room, echoed across the oak table, then slowly faded into silence, and Tessa didn't answer. She remained seated, her hands loosely folded on the tabletop, allowing the silence to stretch for 1 second, then another, a technique she had learned during all those years spent at the edges of conference rooms, because when silence lasted long enough, the person across from you would eventually spill everything on their own. But this time, she didn't wait for him to collapse. She simply moved her eyes away from Blake and looked past his shoulder toward the chair beside the glass wall, where the young woman with platinum blonde hair had been sitting as silently as a shadow since the meeting began, holding a tablet in her official role as the communications assistant accompanying him, the person whose existence nearly everyone in the room had forgotten. Then Tessa spoke, her voice still as calm as though she were answering a lesson. "Ask your communications director." Every head in the room turned at once. Blake turned slowest, as though his neck were pushing against an invisible resistance, and the moment his eyes met Kendall Price's, Tessa saw the expression of a man completing one final calculation and discovering that the answer had been waiting for him for 3 years, whose name was on the company, where the documents had been delivered, and from whose mailbox that thick envelope without a sender's name had begun its journey. Kendall rose. She placed the tablet on the chair and held her handbag against her chest, the familiar posture of someone protecting herself. Yet something about her was entirely different from the night of the gala. Her shoulders no longer curled inward, her knees no longer seemed ready to give way, and those carefully lined eyes no longer dropped toward the floor. For the first time since Tessa had become aware of this woman's existence, Kendall Price looked directly at Blake Sinclair, and when she spoke, the voice that had once been as sweet as syrup had disappeared completely, leaving only the flat, dry tone of someone who had finished crying many nights ago. "You put my name on that company, Blake," she said. "I was 24 years old. You handed me a stack of papers and told me to sign them because it was only a formality, and I signed because I trusted you. Every document connected to that company has been sent to my address for 3 years. Every bank letter, every tax notice. They filled an entire drawer that I never bothered to open because you told me you would take care of the company paperwork." She stepped closer to the table. "And you didn't even remember. You remember your partner's birthdays. You remember the names of bankers' wives. You even remember my dress size so you can buy clothes that make me look the way you want at parties. But you couldn't remember that you put your entire prison sentence inside my mailbox." Her voice didn't rise, and that made it sharper. "Last week, I heard what your lawyer said. If this comes apart, I will be the first one hit, not you." She stopped in front of him, close enough for him to see that she wasn't trembling. "I loved you, Blake. Believe it or don't, but I won't go to prison for you." When she finished, she didn't wait for his answer. She didn't look at Tessa or anyone else. Kendall Price turned and walked the length of the glass room with straight, even steps, opened the door, and left. The heavy glass door closed behind her with a dry, precise click, as final as the locking of a gate that would never open again. The room sank into a thick silence, and Tessa sat there watching the circle close with almost mathematical precision. The man who had directed her humiliation at the gala, the man who had dragged the most painful secrets of his former wife into the open and offered them as entertainment to his mistress, had now been betrayed by that same mistress, who had used his secrets as her passage to freedom. He had taught the woman beside him that loyalty was something to discard whenever it became inconvenient, and she had learned the lesson better than he ever imagined. The chief attorney was the first to move. He removed his reading glasses, folded them, slipped them into his breast pocket, then closed the black file in front of him, with hands that had regained their professional steadiness. "Mr. Sinclair," he said in the level voice of a man reading a clause from a contract, "these documents extend beyond the boundaries of a civil dispute. They indicate possible federal financial crimes. Our firm practices corporate law. We advise on contracts and handle commercial litigation. We don't defend criminal cases. You need a different kind of attorney." He pushed back his chair and stood. His 2 younger associates immediately followed, packing their briefcases with the quick, efficient movements of people eager to leave a scene before it exploded. "Sit down," Blake shouted, and this time his voice broke completely, splitting in the middle of the sentence like a rotten piece of timber snapping in half. "I pay you. Sit down." But no one sat. The 3 lawyers walked past him one by one. The last one even gave Cassian a slight nod, an instinctive gesture of respect that had become part of the bloodstream of the city's legal world. Then the glass door opened again, closed again, and the second click sounded through the room. Blake Sinclair stood alone at the head of the conference table. Both hands were still braced against the wood, and the 3 black files lay open before him like 3 wounds. Behind him, the transparent glass wall looked down upon the tiny streams of people and cars moving through the streets below, none of them knowing or caring that high above them, an empire had just taken its final breath. He stood there in absolute isolation beneath the bright lights of the glass room, without a mistress, without lawyers, without a single pair of eyes still looking at him with even the smallest trace of respect. Tessa remained seated and watched the scene with a strange stillness in her heart, because she realized that fate possessed a peculiar sense of humor. 3 months earlier, in the glittering ballroom of the Drake Hotel, he had arranged for her to stand alone while 300 people gathered around, eager to watch her break apart. And today, inside a room surrounded by 4 glass walls, he received the same punishment in return. There was only one difference. That night, Ruby had still been there to hold Tessa's hand. Blake had no one left. And then, amid that ruined silence, Cassian Rourke spoke for the first time since the meeting had begun. Until that moment, he had merely sat there leaning back in his chair, watching everything with the composure of a man observing a chess match, whose final move he already knew. But when his voice came, the entire room seemed to shift around it. That deep, heavy voice rolled across the oak table like a stone descending a mountainside, slow and impossible to stop. "Sit down, Sinclair," he said, and Blake, who had just screamed at his own 3 lawyers without being obeyed, sat down almost immediately, the leather chair sinking beneath his diminished body. "I'll be brief," Cassian continued, "because I don't enjoy wasting more time on you than necessary. I don't want your company. It's poisonous, rotten from the foundation. Anyone who takes possession of it now is embracing a decomposing corpse. What I want are the parcels of land you've been quietly collecting around the south side for the past 2 years, the rows of old warehouses, the strips of property wedged between the roads leading down to the waterfront, the lots you purchased through a tangled network of subsidiary companies to block my access, and the same lots you bought with the fraudulent loan money documented in those 3 files." He tapped one finger lightly against the table. "When the money is dirty, the land isn't clean either, Sinclair. Every additional day you keep those properties adds another page to your sentence." Blake opened his mouth to say something, but Tessa opened the leather briefcase one final time and removed the last document, a thin agreement only a few pages long, prepared days earlier with the meticulous care of an entire team of the finest lawyers in the city. She placed it on the table and gently pushed it forward. The paper slid to a neat stop beside the 3 black files. "This is a transfer agreement," she said, her voice remaining as level as it had been all morning. "Every parcel of land you control around the south side, each one fully listed in the attached schedule, will be transferred to Rourke Holdings for $1. In return, Rourke Holdings will assume every debt obligation attached to those properties and repay both banks before they discover exactly how you defrauded them. And these 3 files will remain locked inside a safe instead of traveling to the federal prosecutor's desk. You'll keep the only thing you can still preserve, your freedom outside prison walls. $1. Blake repeated, and a dry laugh without the slightest warmth escaped him. "You're stealing everything from me. This is robbery. I spent my entire life building it, and you're taking it with a sheet of paper and a single dollar." "No one is stealing anything from you," Tessa replied. "I'm saving you from spending 10 years counting the days inside a federal prison. It's the best bargain you've ever received, Blake. And believe me, I know every bargain you've ever signed." He looked at her. He looked for a long time, deeply, with the bloodshot eyes of a man who hadn't slept in 3 nights. And Tessa understood what he was searching for in her face. He was searching for his former wife, the gentlewoman who had cooked porridge and carried it to the hospital every evening, who had typed his financial records without pay and never complained, who had lowered her head and signed divorce papers beside her mother's hospital bed simply to keep the peace. He was searching for the soft place inside her that he had gripped for 4 years to control her, the part that would weaken if he appeared miserable enough, that would tremble if he invoked enough memories. But the ash-gray eyes looking back at him across the length of the oak table were as still as the surface of a lake frozen in January. There was no anger in them, no triumph, and most cruelly of all, there wasn't a trace of pity. The woman he had once held in the palm of his hand no longer existed, and the stranger sitting before him was someone he had created with his own hands. "You destroyed me," he said, his hoarse voice falling into a whisper. "For that crumbling school? For Kendall? For a few ancient grievances between us? Tell me, Tessa, was it worth it?" Tessa tilted her head slightly, the way she did when a student asked an innocent question. "No, Blake," she said, each word falling slowly and clearly. "I destroyed you because today is Tuesday, because my students need a classroom to return to, and because not once during the 4 years we lived together were you intelligent enough to understand the woman who spent 3 years keeping your books without pay. You thought you had married an insignificant schoolteacher. You never asked what she remembered." Blake picked up the pen. His hand trembled so badly that the tip kept slipping away from the signature line, and finally, he had to press his other hand against the table to hold the paper in place before he could force the crooked letters into shape. In the absolute silence of the room, the sound of the pen scratching across the paper seemed unnaturally loud, scraping through each stroke like the sound of something being severed. The signature that had once appeared beneath contracts worth millions, the signature that had made people wait with bowed heads, now crawled across the page in distorted lines like the handwriting of an old man. When he finished, he threw the pen onto the table. It rolled twice and came to rest. Cassian stood. He didn't immediately pick up the document. He straightened to his full height and adjusted the button of his jacket with a slow, careful, almost ceremonial movement, the gesture of a man who had completed a ritual rather than a negotiation. Then he looked at Blake Sinclair for 1 second. There was no contempt in his gaze, no triumph, not even anger. It was merely the glance someone gave a broken object before leaving it behind. Then he turned away without saying a single word to him. That silence was crueler than any sentence, because even the most vicious words still acknowledged that the other person existed. This was absolute rejection. Cassian Rourke had erased Blake Sinclair from the list of things worthy of his attention, forever. He picked up the coat draped across the back of his chair, and his voice returned to its usual calm, as though they had merely finished a morning coffee. "Let's go, Tessa." What happened after that Tuesday morning reached Tessa in 3 pieces of news, brief and dry as 3 telegrams. The first came one evening when Ruby called her, sounding both delighted and unable to believe it. Blake Sinclair had left Chicago on an early flight to Miami with a one-way ticket. His penthouse had been put up for sale, and the bank had towed away his sports car right in front of the building. Yet what people talked about most wasn't his collapse, but the manner of his departure. Not one business partner came to see him off. Not one golfing friend called. The wealthy world that had once raised glasses in his honor at the Drake Hotel quietly closed behind him like water closing over a pebble, smooth and without a trace. The second piece of news arrived 1 week later, buried on an inside page of the city newspaper, in the dry language of government administration. The school board had passed a resolution, canceling the proposed closure of Riverside Elementary after the related land redevelopment plan became invalid. That same month, the board member who had once fought most aggressively for the closure quietly submitted his resignation for personal reasons, and the full cost of renovating the school was covered by a newly established private foundation. The third piece of news was the one Tessa had never expected. One morning, an envelope from the Department of Education appeared in her mailbox. Inside was an order reinstating her, restoring all her rights and benefits, along with a document she had to read twice before she could believe it, a public apology for suspending her without sufficient grounds. Principal Walter Hargrove himself was required to read it before the entire school during the Monday morning assembly. He stood at the podium holding the paper in both trembling hands, his voice faltering when he reached the sentence, "The school respectfully apologizes to Miss Tessa Ward." And when he finished, it wasn't the teachers who applauded loudest. It was the children. The uneven clapping of hundreds of small hands echoed across the schoolyard in the morning light. But to Tessa, all of that existed only at the edges. The heart of everything lay in one bright, golden morning at the beginning of winter, when she stood before the gates of Riverside Elementary, freshly painted a gentle shade of blue. The fence stood straight and clean. The newly paved playground still carried the sharp scent of fresh asphalt. And beside the gatepost, beneath a red cloth waiting to be pulled away, was a small bronze plaque whose every word she had chosen herself. The Margaret Ward Renovation Fund. Her mother's name. The woman who had bent her back working 2 jobs so her daughter could receive an education would now remain forever beside the gate through which hundreds of laughing children passed every morning. When the red cloth slipped away and the early sunlight touched the polished bronze. Tessa reached out and gently traced the engraved letters. "Mom?" she whispered silently in her heart. "I've paid the debt, not the $80,000. That debt had required only money. She meant the greater debt, the debt of living a life with her back held straight." Then the first day of school came again, and Tessa stepped into her classroom through the rich smell of fresh paint. The walls were warm cream, the screws on every desk and chair had been tightened, and the autumn drawings from the previous year had been returned to their old places. 22 children filled the rows, 22 faces she had missed, until the ache twisted inside her during those weeks spent among bank statements and court orders. They rushed toward her, chattering like sparrows bursting from a nest. "Miss Ward, where did you go for so long? Miss Ward, look how pretty our classroom is now." And in the very first row, in the seat the little girl had chosen for herself after moving from the back of the room, Maeve sat perfectly straight, with 2 braids tied so evenly that they matched to the last strand, because her uncle had finally learned how to divide her hair properly. The first lesson passed like a gift. When Tessa asked the class who could tell her how to sound out a word, Maeve's hand shot up first, straight and high. "Miss Ward, I know." The child stood and read every sound clearly and correctly, without missing a single one. When Tessa smiled, nodded, and said, "Very good," the whole class clapped and laughed, while Maeve sat down with pink cheeks and a smile stretching from ear to ear. The child who had once spent an entire year communicating through nods and shakes of her head had become the loudest volunteer in the room. At the end of the school day, after the children had poured into the yard like bees from a broken hive, Maeve lingered behind. She searched through her school bag and pulled out an envelope folded from yellow craft paper, its clumsy, uneven creases carefully pressed flat. She pushed it into her teacher's hand, then stood there twisting the strap of her bag between her fingers. "You can read it at home if you'd like." But Tessa opened it immediately. Inside, written in purple marker with all the careful effort an 8-year-old hand could manage, were the words, "Thank you for fixing Uncle Cass. He smiles now. He never smiled before." Beneath them was a drawing of 3 round faces, all smiling. Tessa read the words again and again, then lowered herself until she was level with the child and wrapped her in a tight embrace. "Thank you," she said. "You know something? You're the one who fixed everything." After Maeve ran outside to join her friends, Tessa stood alone in the classroom in the afternoon light. Sunbeams entered through the windows, laying warm golden bands across the little desks. She looked around the room where, 3 months earlier, she had sat among empty chairs with a suspension notice folded into quarters inside her pocket and an empty space inside her chest. The same 4 walls remained, the same green chalkboard remained, but the woman standing there was someone else now. Quietly, she searched her own heart the way someone might touch an old wound, looking for the familiar ache whenever the name Blake Sinclair passed through her mind. But there was nothing left. No pain, no hatred, not even contempt. The wound had healed into a scar without her noticing when it happened, and Blake had become nothing more than a character in an old movie she had watched a very long time ago, a bad movie she had no desire to see again. That evening, the familiar black car picked her up after school, but this time, it didn't stop at the 42nd floor. It continued all the way to the top of the tower, where Cassian's penthouse rested in silence amid the night sky, and when the elevator doors opened, Tessa stepped into a softly darkened space illuminated only by the city itself. Enormous windows stretched from floor to ceiling, opening onto the endless golden grid of lights spread far below, while streams of traffic flowed without pause, like tiny veins of light. Far to the south, she could make out the faint glow of the neighborhood she knew so well, where a school had recently been painted a gentle shade of blue. Cassian stood beside the stone counter, and she heard ice touch the side of a crystal glass before she saw him turn around. An amber glass of whiskey rested in his hand, and on the counter, already waiting for her, was a steaming cup of chamomile tea. He remembered. He didn't need to ask. He had never needed to ask. And it was that small detail, the tea prepared before she had even walked through the door, that warmed Tessa's chest with an almost unreasonable tenderness in the middle of that vast room. They stood beside the window in silence for a long while, in the way that had become natural to them both, a silence that didn't need to be filled. Then Cassian spoke, his eyes still fixed on the city below. "Sinclair landed in Miami last week. He didn't buy a return ticket. The property transfers are complete. Both banks were paid in full before they had time to sense that anything was wrong. The files are in the safe, and they will remain there as long as he remembers his place. He turned the whiskey glass slightly, and the ice chimed against the crystal. I had everything checked one final time tonight. Every loose end has been closed. The game is over, Tessa. She nodded and took a sip of tea, waiting, because she could feel that something else stood behind those dry words of explanation. And after a pause, his voice lowered, losing its usual flatness, and taking on an intimate gravity that seemed to thin the air around them. Our contract has been fulfilled, he said. Your mother's medical debt has been cleared, down to the last dollar. Your school is safe. Your name has been restored, along with a public apology. That means every condition you set in that room on the 42nd floor has now been met, and it also means, he turned fully toward her, you're free, Tessa. You can return to your ordinary life tomorrow. Teach your students. Live quietly in your clean world. Forget the past 3 months as though they were a fever. No one will trouble you again. I guarantee that with the Rourke name. He paused, and Tessa saw his jaw tighten slightly, as though the words that followed had to be forced through a heavy door. But if you stay, you need to understand exactly what that means. You stay completely. There is no halfway. You've seen how I operate during these past 3 months. You've seen how I build files on people, how I arrange a board for 2 years simply to make one move. You know what the telephone calls I take at midnight are about. My world has no days off and no way back. The people beside me are protected absolutely, but they have to stand in the darkness with me forever. So I'm giving you this way out, Tessa. Once and only once. And I need you to choose while your mind is at its clearest. You know exactly what kind of man I am. He wasn't speaking about the tutoring contract. They both understood that. He wasn't speaking about work, payment, or any condition that could be written on paper. The man who had never made one move without calculating the next 3 was doing the most reckless thing of his life. He was placing the entire game in another person's hands and standing there waiting. Tessa looked at him, truly looked at him beneath the golden light rising from the city. This was the man who had watched her as a piece on a board, then walked through the rain to her door to confess it. The man who had built a fortress around himself for 34 years, then opened the gate with his own hands and allowed her to step inside and see everything. He could have kept her through 100 intricate bonds, yet he had chosen to remove every one of them and leave only an open door. The silence stretched until even the distant murmur of the city could be heard through the thick glass. Then Tessa set her cup down on the stone counter. The quiet sound of porcelain touching stone was small and precise, like a decision. She took one step forward, erasing the final distance between them, lifted her face, and looked directly into those winter lake eyes. When she spoke, not one note of her voice trembled. I know exactly what kind of man you are, Cassian, she said. You're the man who told me on the very first night that you had no interest in fragile things because they required too much effort to protect. I remember every word. And you were right. But look at me. Life has been forging me for 27 years, through one furnace after another, loss piled upon betrayal, until what remains standing here can't be broken anymore. She tilted her head, and a thin, sharp smile slowly appeared at the corner of her mouth. So calculate again, Cassian. I'm not something that wandered into your world. I'm something made to fit inside it. And in the golden light of the entire city rising around them, Tessa saw something perhaps no one else in the world had ever been allowed to witness. Those dark green eyes deepened, growing darker like the surface of a lake before a storm, and the careful control that man had worn like armor for 34 years cracked open before her. His hand rose slowly and slipped behind her neck, his warm, rough fingers supporting her with the steadiness of an anchor, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with the exact precision of every movement he had made on the night of the gala 3 months earlier. But this time, there weren't 300 eager pairs of eyes surrounding them, no gold-plated ballroom, no performance to give, no move to make, only 2 people standing in a darkened room with an entire city glowing beneath them. That night, he had told her to stand still. Tonight, his voice dropped, until it was little more than breath touching her lips. Stay. And the second kiss came. Not like the sudden, possessive wave of the first, but slowly, firmly, deeply, like a seal pressed onto a covenant written over 3 months of trust, of cups of chamomile tea, of 2 separate griefs confessed across an old tea table. Tessa let her hand slide up the front of his jacket, her fingers tightening around the lapel and drawing him closer, and within that kiss, she tasted the faint burn of whiskey, and something she had never tasted from anyone in her entire life. The feeling of being chosen completely, without conditions and without calculation. When they parted, he didn't step back. His forehead rested against hers, his breathing still uneven. And he said quietly, "You didn't merely step into my world, Tessa. You tore it apart and stitched it back together with the thread of a third-grade teacher. You're terrifying." Tessa laughed softly in the narrow space of a single breath. "Is that a complaint?" She felt his rare smile touch her forehead before she heard his answer. "It's a surrender." They remained that way for a long time, forehead against forehead, in a room illuminated only by the city, and Tessa looked over his shoulder, toward the golden grid of lights, stretching to the horizon below. Amid the magnificent, yet frigid sea of the financial district, where men like Blake Sinclair had once raised glasses and lavish parties had turned human beings into entertainment, her eyes searched toward the south side. There, small but enduring, the light of Riverside Elementary glowed like a point of warmth in the poor neighborhood, the lamp the elderly security guard still lit every night beside the gate, bearing the bronze plaque with her mother's name. And Tessa suddenly understood that the skyline beyond the glass no longer belonged only to the city. It belonged to them, to two people who had lost almost everything and found one another among the ruins, and to 22 children who would still have a classroom to enter the next morning, who would still have their teacher waiting beside the green chalkboard, who would still have a future no one could ever take away again. And so, the story of teacher Tessa Ward and crime lord Cassian Rourke came to an end. The story of a woman abandoned in a second-hand dress, who rose from the bitterest humiliation of her life, not through tears or blind hatred, but through intelligence, compassion, and a heart that refused to break, reclaiming her honor, saving her school, and finding an equal love beside the man who had once seemed colder than anyone else in the city. Dear viewers and friends, how did this story make you feel? Which moment moved you most deeply? Was it the kiss beneath the gaze of 300 people, the silent cup of chamomile tea at midnight, or the moment Tessa stood in her classroom and realized that her wound had finally healed? Please share the feelings in your heart in the comments below. We sincerely hope to read every thought you choose to share. If today's story touched your heart, please press like, share this video with your friends and loved ones, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss the captivating stories we bring to you every day. Finally, we wish everyone watching this video abundant health, a joyful life, and peaceful, contented days beside the people you love. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.